Luke chapter 7, and we begin at verse 11. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that you preserved this for thousands of years now, and that any time we want to, we live in a country and a place where we can pull this book out anytime we want to and learn something about you. What an amazing opportunity that is, and let us never, ever take it for granted. Lord, I ask you to speak to us from this passage. Show us more of your beauty. Show us more of who you are. Glorify yourself through the words we read tonight. Lord, protect me that I wouldn't say anything that you don't want said. Lord, speak to each person here. Clean this place of any evil that has found its way in. Cleanse it completely, the entire building. This is your house. And fill it to absolute overflowing out into the streets, into the next building, into the pot place on the corner. Lord, just let your spirit emanate from this place and be tangible to all who are here and even those who come close. And all this we ask in the blessed and beautiful name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. We were just talking about that before you came here.
So, last week we looked at the healing of the centurion's servant. A well-liked Roman centurion sends Jewish leaders to ask Jesus for a miracle. Jesus goes, but is stopped along the way, not worthy to come into my home, the centurion says. Jesus marvels at this man's faith and comments that he has not found such faith in any Israelite. Jesus holds this man up as an example. Jesus holds him up as the type of person who will be given eternal life and spend eternity with God, dining at his table with the patriarchs of Israel, while the sons of the patriarchs will be cast into outer darkness because they did not believe. Now, we don't know, actually, the heritage of the centurion. He could have been Roman, that was possible. But from a lot of what I've read, a lot of the Roman troops were actually Syrian. This man could very well have been one of northern Israel's, especially arch enemies. And here is Jesus. We know for sure he was not a Jew. Jews did not join the Roman army, and frankly, I don't think the Roman army wanted them. They had a reputation as being troublemakers. But it very well could have been one of Israel's arch enemies that was being held up. Not just a Roman, not just a centurion, but a Syrian Roman centurion. And this is the man Jesus holds up as an example to and an indictment against the Jews after delivering the Sermon on the Mount. And frankly, there's a lot of hope in that. Jesus does not care about your lineage. He does not care what peoples you come from. And for some of us, that is really, really good news. It doesn't matter. Here we were talking about ethnic backgrounds, but it was because they were idol worshipers that they were at enmity with Israel. But if you come from a family of drunks or abusers or physical, verbal, Jesus doesn't care. And the devil, he likes to use that. He likes to whisper in your ear, I know where you come from. Jesus ain't going to have nothing to do with you. And even after you give yourself, I know where you come from. I know who you really are. And I'm going to keep reminding you of it until I get you to walk away. So don't give in to that, because we see right here, Jesus doesn't care who you are or where you're from. And it's not just the after, it's not just the Acts model of the church, but this is Jesus himself reaching out to people that his people said he shouldn't even talk to. And he's holding them up as an example. All that matters to Jesus, and by extension, God, is faith. In fact, it causes him to marvel when he finds it. So this week's event in Jesus' life that we're going to look at is exclusive to Luke's gospel. You'll find this account nowhere else in the Gospels. So let's see what Luke shares with us, or what the Spirit wants Luke to share with us. Verse 11, now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. As we saw in the Sermon on the Mount, and I think that's one of the places that was most evident because we looked at it so many times, Jesus' sayings are not pearls of wisdom, but logical links in a chain that build and logically answer arguments and prove statements. Jesus' successive actions often work in the exact same way. Jesus does a series of actions that when he makes a statement, proves that statement. I've already laid the groundwork. And that's actually what we're getting into this week. Another foundational event that's going to color what we're going to look at next week. When I'm looking for this kind of stuff, I usually look for very specific time frames given. The last event immediately followed the Sermon on the Mount, the healing of the centurion's servant. We got context, and Jesus walked down the mountain, went to Capernaum, and this happened. We got a very succinct timeline. We get that here too. This next event that we're looking at today follows directly next thing. In fact, the word translated the day after is hexeis, which means successively in order. Now, when you look at the time frame and the distances and everything, it's obviously that would have to be a day later, but that's more of an interpretation actually than an actual translation. It's successively in order, the next following, the next in succession. So the very next thing Jesus did is go to Nain. I think it's obvious that the Spirit is wanting us to see this series of events as a larger picture. And next week, that picture will kind of come into focus. But this series of events is building to a larger picture. So, Jesus travels to the city of Nain. It's map time. The modern, the village of Nain, modern, it's N-E-I-N. I don't know if that changes the pronunciation, but there is still a modern village on this site called Nain, or Nine, maybe. was on the northern slope of the hill of Moreh, 5 miles south of Nazareth. It was a pleasant and fertile spot where the southern end of the Galilee region bordered the international trade routes of the Jezreel Valley. Archaeological evidence from the 1st century AD is meager. A gate has not been found, although what has been uncovered is sufficient to establish a Jewish presence at the place. Nain is midway between Endor and Shunem. So on this map, Capernaum, where Jesus was with the centurion servant. Just up here was the mount where the Sermon on the Mount was given. So he travels down. Nazareth is here as a point of reference, 5 miles south. So he travels from Capernaum all the way down to Nain, which is on this slope of this hill. Endor is here, and Shunem is right here. That's going to be very significant later. So I'll pass this around, take a look at it, geography. More and more I'm finding every city has some significance. Jerusalem, but there's some cities that Jesus goes to all the time. Capernaum, Jerusalem, Nazareth gets mentioned a couple of times. But these one-offs, these one-off visits where a name of a city or a place is given, man, when you dig under the surface just a little bit, it's awesome. This is significant, and I will bring it in a little bit later. So after delivering the Sermon on the Mount and healing the centurion servant, Jesus makes a trek 20 miles southwest out of Capernaum to the city of Nain. And he is not alone. It tells us that many of his disciples and a very large crowd are with him. Verse 12. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. There is so much going on in this verse. My goodness. First, the obvious, a young man has died and his body is being carried outside of the city walls to be buried. Bodies were not buried like they are here in the West, in a box in the ground or just in the ground. I don't know why this tradition developed over there, but they put them in caves. They stone slabs. They would actually cut. A lot of the soil over there is sandstone, the rock, and so it is easily chiselable, and so they would chisel out inside of caves ledges, and they would set them on there, and then they would go away. And like a year later, they would come back, and by then nature has done its thing. That's why they called these sarcophagus. It's flesh eater, eats all the, and they would take all the bones and put them into an estuary box, a box carved out of stone, and they would put all the bones in them. And then they had another cave, or maybe in another part of that cave, they'd have little, like a mausoleum at a cemetery where all the urns get put, and they would put this estuary box on the shelf, and that was its spot. So that kind of factors in too. Now, of course, because it's smart, you always bury a body outside of the city. I don't know why we've taken to putting, or maybe we put cemeteries outside of cities and then the cities grow around them. But that's generally a bad idea, keeping dead bodies around. But for the Jews, it was particularly a bad idea because, according to what God had told them, that made them ritually unclean to be near a body. And then there's that whole disease thing and rats, and if a guy's died of something, the last thing you want to do is keep it around, so you get it out of the city as soon as possible. And we learn a few things in this passage about the dead man. One, he's an only son, which makes him an only son, and his mother is a widow, which also makes him an orphan or a fatherless child. Not an orphan, a fatherless child. Sorry, I lost my point. Anyway, in Jewish society, the care for a widow would first primarily fall to her sons. No one else under Jewish custom had any obligation to care for a widow. So this woman's husband has died, and now her only and most likely very much loved son is gone as well. I am sure she is mostly devastated over the loss of her beloved boy, the one who would carry on the lineage of her departed husband, but there has to be at least an inkling in the back of her mind of what her future looks like now, that these two beloved men in her life are gone. With no husband and no son to provide for her, she would be completely dependent on the charity of others to survive. Women were generally not educated back then and had few prospects to earn an income outside of the home. She might have been left to glean fields at harvest time, begging on the street, or looking to other members of her family, if she had any, to survive. There are no welfare programs to speak of. That's got to be rolling around in the back of her head. You've got to be thinking, whoa, what am I going to do? And then we have a location, the city gate. In these old walled cities, small walled cities throughout Jerusalem in the Middle East, the city gate was the seat of city government. This is where the elders or the rulers sat and heard disputes from within the city, from people who lived outside of the city. Think of Boaz in the story of Ruth when he goes to get the claim the right he had to buy the property that used to be Ruth's, and there's people taking off shoes and spitting and slapping each other and secret handshake, and then they're out of there. But the elders are all sitting there. So they also controlled who came in and out of the city. This is also where they collected taxes on goods going in and out of the city. This is probably where Matthew once sat. Of course, it was in Capernaum. This was the seat of the government in these city-states. The city gate represents the law. And here Jesus rolled up on the scene with many of his disciples and a large crowd. There has to be a huge disparity between the mood of the two crowds. One group would be mourning and sad. That would be, of course, the group passing through the city gate under the law. The other group would have been fairly jovial and excited. They'd just seen Jesus heal a whole bunch of people before the Sermon on the Mount, and then this incredible teaching, and he taught with authority, and they've never heard anybody teach like that. And then he comes back down to Capernaum, and he heals some Roman centurion's servant, and now we're just... They got to be kind of up. And they're free and roaming from city to city, proclaiming the good news. They are under the giver of life. So right here, just in giving this location, we see acted out, the law kills, but following Jesus brings life and freedom from the curse of the law.
Let's just read right by that.
Verse 13. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." First, notice the sudden change in how Luke titles Jesus. In verse 12, now it happened the day after that he went into the city of Nain. Of his disciples went with him. Verse 12, and when he came near the gate. And now, suddenly in verse 13, Luke addresses him, calls him, labels him the Lord. He could have just as easily said, he said to her, or when he saw her, as he's done previously, suddenly he changes the Lord. And I think this is an absolute deliberate translation from the use of pronouns to a title. We were meant to see Jesus not as Jesus the man, or even as Jesus the Messiah. The Holy Spirit, through Luke, wants us to see in this moment Jesus as Lord, the incarnation of God himself. This is a window into Jesus' heart, and thus it is a window into the heart of God the Father and the whole of the Godhead. Remember from last week, to hear from a man's representative is the same thing as hearing from the man himself. And Jesus has made this point himself. In John 14, 8 through 10, Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. When we read here that when Jesus saw her, he had compassion on her, is to read when God saw her, he had compassion on her. This widow just heard, do not weep, from the mouth of God. Compassion. My best description of what compassion is, or what it means to feel compassion, is when my heart feels your pain. Jesus is feeling this woman's pain. Do you get the implications of this? God sees this woman and feels her pain. You have to look at this and go, our God, Yahweh, is a personal God. Amen. He loves us so much that our pain causes him pain. This sets Christianity apart from absolutely every other religion in the world, past and present. In every other religion in the world, there is an impersonal God set someplace, and you are working your way into his good graces, or you are working your way to just get noticed by him. All of the Greek and Roman gods, you had to do something miraculous to even be noticed. And then there's rituals and working and sacrifices, and if I kill enough animals and put them on the altar, and if he might notice me. That's not our God. And we're not making this up. This isn't something that we've just, you know what, I don't like these other gods, I'm going to make up my own personal God. No, that's not what's happening here. The incarnation of God has encountered a weeping widow, and he feels her pain and acts to alleviate it. We have evidence. It happened. We're not making this up. We have the actions of God himself in the person of Jesus to show us that this is who our God is. And it's not just here. This is not really a new thing. We're just seeing it acted out. All over the Old Testament, we see that God has a heart for the most vulnerable people in our society. Orphans, widows, strangers, and the poor. 10 times in Deuteronomy, God commands that some type of provision be made for the fatherless and the widows. Exodus 22:22, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Psalms 94:6, the wicked, they slay the widow and the stranger and murder the fatherless. By extension, the righteous protect, do the opposite. Psalms 146:9, the Lord watches over the strangers. He relieves the fatherless and the widow, but the way of the wicked he turns upside down. It is God's heart to provide and protect these vulnerable people, and he tells those that believe in him to do the same. Isaiah 1:17, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. Jeremiah 7:5-7. For if you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if you do not oppress the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place or walk after other gods to your hurt, then I will cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever. Jeremiah 22:3, thus says Yahweh, execute judgment and righteousness and deliver the plundered out of the hand of the oppressor. Do no wrong and do no violence to the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place. And Zechariah 7:10, do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. Let none of you plan evil in his heart against his brother. And God doesn't just tell us to do it. He came to earth and he did it himself. God spoke through the prophets and often indicted and judged Israel based on how they treated the stranger, the fatherless, and the widows. Not just because those things are condemnable in and of themselves, they are, but because how you treat the vulnerable members of a society is an indication of where your heart is in relation to God. If you're truly walking with God, his heart becomes your heart. The things he cares about are the things you care about. Amos 3:3, can two walk together unless they are agreed? Think about it. Jesus has got his disciples and he's cruising through and he stops to help a widow, and then he stops to help an orphan, and then he gets over here to Nain and there's a widow and a dead father of the son being carried out. So are you over here going, Jesus, do you see the time? Don't we got places to go? Or are you comforting the widow while Jesus raises the son?
Amen.
Are we part of his plan? Is our heart where his heart is? If it's not, if we don't have compassion like Jesus, maybe we're not walking as closely with Jesus as we think we are, as we'd like to think we are. This is God's heart. The people that we don't have time for, the people that we marginalize and push away, God's got the biggest heart for. And over again, he's going, take care of them, take care of them, take care of them, make provision for them. It's God's heart, and it should be ours too. verse 14, very first part of it. Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. Open coffin is not a really good translation here. I believe it's an effort by the New King James revisers to give a relatable or understandable term. We understand coffins. They really didn't use coffins back then. The King James Version translates it as a bier. And maybe they were just worried people would get the wrong impression, but it's B-E-I-R, so. Which is a funeral couch. Now for a rich guy, this is a big elaborate thing. It's probably on a cart with wheels and there's cushions because, you want to be comfortable when you're dead. And tents and big gold
Tassels.
But we have no indication whatsoever that these are rich or affluent people. So there's most likely a piece of cloth strung between two sticks, or a wooden plank with some handles and maybe some feet attached to it. And Jesus walks past the widow and touches the stretcher or the plank of wood. And those carrying it stop. Now we all think Jesus is about to do something and they must have picked up on that and so they stopped. I don't think so. I think they stopped because they were aghast. They were in absolute shock at what Jesus had just did. By touching the bier carrying a dead body, Jesus, if he were a mere man, would have just made himself unclean for 7 days. And you got to get ashes of a red heifer, and it's got to be, and then the priest got to sprinkle you, and you got to wash twice during the whole. I mean, they're like, just for the sheer sake of what it will take to get out of this, what are you thinking? What are you doing? I think they stopped because, what is that crazy guy? Did he just touch that? Whoa. But Jesus, he's not a mere man. As we saw this before, remember the leper that came to him? And he said, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus said, I'm willing. And he reaches out and he touches him. And for the first time ever, the unclean touched the clean. The clean touched the unclean and made the unclean clean. Because everywhere else in the whole history of the Bible, clean touching unclean makes clean unclean. And we flipped the whole thing on its head. And here's number 2. Jesus touches something and the unclean is made clean. The second part of verse 14 and verse 15. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Notice, Jesus did not say, live. Jesus did not say, life come back into the boy. He commands the boy to do something. And with those words comes the power to carry it out. And also notice, Jesus does not touch the boy. He touched the bier. He touched but he doesn't actually touch the boy. In many places we see Jesus healing with a touch, or he performs a miracle by doing something with his hands, touching fish, bread. But here he simply speaks. And I think it's meant to show us something very specific. When he does something with his hands, we see his power. He has this. It flows out of him. He touches, it's healed. He touches, it multiplies. But when he speaks a miracle and it happens, it shows us not the power he possesses, but the authority that he has. Remember again from last week, what the centurion said to Jesus. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he doesn't. And from a distance that day, Jesus commanded that the centurion's servant be made well, just like he was telling a soldier to come or go. Here, Jesus is showing us that his authority goes far beyond merely healing. Jesus has been given the authority to command life and death, to come and go like a man commands his butler to clear the table or to clean up the kitchen. And the boy's body answers the command of Jesus as his life is returned, and he begins to speak, showing all present that Jesus had not just animated his body, but returned his life to him. Cognizant, awake, of sound mind. Now this verse says he presented him to his mother. No. The word translated presented is didomi, and it means literally in every sense to give. He gave this mother back her son. He gave this widow back an opportunity to have a future, to not be a beggar on the street, to not be alone for the rest of her life. Jesus gave this woman back everything she had lost. I think one of the most brilliant things here is not a single person asked for this miracle. Not a one. Nobody said, Jesus, would you take care of this? The woman didn't say, Master, can you do something for me? Nobody asked. Not a single person. Jesus just saw a need. And it broke his heart. And he walked in and did it. And it's got to make you wonder how many things in your life God is just taking care of. I didn't even know I needed that. I didn't even know that was going to be an issue. I think we're going to get to heaven and we're just going to see how many things that he's just worked and taken care of because we're his and he sees the need and he just takes care of it. Now, if you're as broken as I am, you got to go, well, if he noticed that, how come he doesn't notice all these other things in my life that I need taken care of? God notices every single need. And it has to mean, if he hasn't just taken care of it, then there has to be some other purpose behind it. There has to be. Because Jesus just sees needs and takes care of them. If there's some need in our life, if there is something broken and it hasn't been fixed yet, God has to have a bigger purpose involved. Has to. And I could give you a whole bunch of examples, but I'm not going to do that because we only have so much time. Verse 16. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. This is a very interesting series of statements. It starts off with, then fear came upon them all. And I looked it up because a lot of times fear in Old English meant awe or wonder, and I looked it up, and it's not. It's phobos, which is where we get our word phobia from. It means straight up they were afraid. They were afraid. But in that fear, they glorified God. It seems opposite, and yet And then the part I kind of want to focus on here, and we're going to bring everything kind of around, is a great prophet has risen up among us. And often when great prophets did things, they didn't attribute them to the prophet, which is right. I don't know why we can't get that right today. Because somebody does something awesome today, nobody goes, praise God. They go, what an awesome dude. Can you believe him? He's so spiritual. That's not what the Bible teaches us. A great prophet has risen up among us. Now there were two great prophets of the Old Testament. Most people consider Elijah to be the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. I'm going to argue that point because if you remember, when Elijah left, Elisha asked for a double portion of what he got. And God gave him confirmation and smacking the mantle on the water and the water parts. So Elijah gets better press, but I think Elisha got double what Elijah did. And Elijah raised one person from the dead. Elijah raised one person from the dead. Elisha technically raised two. There was one during his life, and then somebody fell on his bones and came back to life. And so I think it took longer, but I think he got the extra, so he did get the double portion. But Elijah, as I alluded to, raised a widow's son from the dead in 1 Kings 17. But Elisha also raised a young boy from the dead, and I want to actually go into that story. So 2 Kings chapter 4, beginning at verse 18 through 37. And the child grew. Now it happened one day that he went out to his father, to the reapers. And he said to his father, my head, my head. So he said to his servant, carry him to his mother. Typical father. When he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon, and then died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God. Elisha was staying in an upper room that they had built for her. So they had the families, and shut the door upon him and went out. And then she called to her husband and said, please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back. So he said, why are you going to him today? It's neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. And she said, it is well. Then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, drive and go forward, and do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you. And so she departed and went to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So it was, when the man of God saw her afar off, that he sent his servant, Gehazi, look, the Shunammite woman. Please run now to meet her and say to her, is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with your child? And she answered, it is well. Now when she came to the man of God at the hill, she just wants to talk to the man. Forget this Gehazi character. I want Elisha. And she answered, she caught him by the feet, but Gehazi came near to push her away. But the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. So she said, did I ask a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? Then he said to Gehazi, he's figured out what's going on here, get yourself ready and take my staff in your hand and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child. And the mother of the child said, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you. So he arose and followed her. Now Gehazi went on ahead of them and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet him and told him, saying, the child has not awakened. You get this frenzied picture of everything that's going on, people back and forth. And when Elisha came into the house, there was the child lying dead on his bed. He went in, therefore, shut the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. And he went up, and he lay on the child, and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. Then the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And he called Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite woman." So he called her, and when she came in to him, he said, "Pick up your son." So she went in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. You ever wonder what a Shunammite woman is? It's a woman from the town of Shunem.
Oh.
Oh,
Oh.
yes. Did you get the little
There's
goosebumps?
always a reason for it.
Nain, if you remember, is situated between Endor, which is not a good place. That's where Saul went to find the, bad place. But very, very, very close, much closer than it is to Endor. Nain almost runs into Shunem. Now, I can't be dogmatic about this, but I'd be willing to bet that Nain didn't exist at the time that Elisha raised this boy from the dead. And I'd be willing to bet that Jesus is standing on the property of the Shunammite woman and her husband. I'd be willing to bet. Can't be dogmatic about it, but I'm going to put myself out and say that. At the very least, this is the kind of story that would have been handed down for generations. And when you went to the synagogue and you heard teachings, that happened right down the street. That just over the hill, that's where that happened. Your uncle's brother's cousin's mother's was there. This is the kind of thing that would have been talked about and talked about and talked about. And Elisha would have been kind of like the, I'm not going to go all Catholic, but patron saint of the area. It would have been his area. This is the area where Elisha used to run, and this is, so when and Jesus walks up, and he doesn't need to lay on anybody. He doesn't need to run around. He doesn't need to put his eyes or his mouth. He just speaks. And a dead boy is given back to his mother.
Sneezing.
No sneezing, no coughing, just arise. And I'm willing to bet it was in the same place that Elisha did it. And that's why the people said a great prophet has risen up among the people, because Jesus just showed himself to be the greatest prophet of all time.
Wow.
And verse 17, and this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding area. It's one thing when 6 people are getting well. You can blame that on a lot of things. Or you can try and attribute that to a lot of things. People are getting freed of demons. Hey, maybe the demon was just bored and decided to go. It was a coincidence. But when a dead man sits up and starts talking, that's gonna get around. And I believe it's this talking. And Susie's got the map back there. They're at the southern end of Galilee, but for this to get to Judea, because it goes throughout all of Judea, it has to get all the way through Samaria, or out over the Sea of Galilee, and down through the Decapolis, and then over, because you can't go through the Samaritan area, because those people were, and it went everywhere. This isn't the kind of thing that anybody can do. In fact, nobody can do it on their own. This is God. This is the God that spoke life into existence. This is the God that said, let there be light.
Mm.
No one else could have the authority to say, live. And it happens. I'm so sorry. And the fame of this goes everywhere. And next week, we're going to see the talk of this makes it to one ear in particular.
Mm.
And it causes him to ask Jesus, to need to ask Jesus some questions. And that's where we'll pick up next week.